before we start the program. If you're not familiar with the building and you need them, the restrooms, just as you go out the door, little cattywampus across the hall, and also down the far. Ready? Okay, first of all, the presentation is based on research and the archaeological results that we did for to support the restoration of the Concord Point Light. And it's called actually the Concord Point Light Station, and it's the Keeper's Dwelling. That's the technical name that you'll find in the records. And my real objective in coming back and doing this program is looking around, I realized that most of the people that I meet in the Friends of the Concord Point weren't around when this project went on. And also, most of our city officials were not only not around, but not even in town. I mean, the connections with, not only with the Concord Point and the town. So I thought somewhere we need to make that link, and they are going to record this and have it for reference. And I apologize and accept all responsibility for any errors or mistakes that we may have made along the way, and I'm sure we made one or two. In order to understand, let's see. Oops, that way. What did I do? What did I do, Jimmy? Oh, there we go. All right, in order, my fingers are arthritic, so that's another problem. In order to understand any particular event, you really should be able to put it in the perspective of the whole. And I'm just take a minute or two and kind of set when the when the lighthouse was constructed, and a little bit of the background and the conditions. It was a very young nation, and if you recall your American history in high school, the actual Constitution Convention came about, the United States Constitution came about because there was a convention to take care of the commercial problems between Maryland and New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Each state was charging tariffs. So once the federal government got underway under the U.S. Constitution, and these things were being changed. And to improve commerce, and particularly commerce within the country, there was an infrastructure that needed to be, oops, when it jumped ahead, that needed to be put in place. And this involved the canals, and I'm sure you're familiar with the C&D Canal was completed before the lighthouse was built. The Susquehanna Tidewater, our own canal, was being envisioned to be put, and of course the C&O Canal. And if you're going to have water transportation, which is the primary, I don't know why I keep doing that. That's what I was afraid of, that I'd be clicking the wrong thing. You need to be able to know where these things are and know where the hazards and whatever else, and aids to navigation were a necessary part of this. Pardon? Sure. Come on, pull the chair over. There you go. This is my youngest daughter. She came up to rescue me. Okay. And incidentally, I left this source up here for people to look at. This is from Benjamin Latrobe, and it's Turkey Point looking north to Havre that he did back in 1804. But he sent a letter to Thomas Jefferson. He said, "There's a light needed at Havre." Okay, Jen. All right. Most of the information that I'm going to be covering in the early part of this, the history part of it, a good part of it came from this particular report, which was a Clio report done by historic architects. They went in and made probes, pulled off materials from the modern building to see if, how much of the fabric of the 1827, 1884 building remained. And in their report, they said we need archaeological work done. And that's where the Archaeological Society of Northern Chesapeake, which is your host tonight, and our president, Dan Coates, here, that's where we came in. We volunteered to take on that task. But in order to do the task, we had to do a little bit of history and research to know what we were looking for and when we were looking for it. Okay, Jen. Now, with the establishment of the federal government, the construction of these lighthouses came under the Department of Treasury. Everyone hear me okay in the back? Okay. And this particular one man, Thomas Pleasanton, was in charge primarily until around 1848. And virtually whatever he said, that was what was done. Okay? And he was the guy who decided what was going to be built, where it was going to be built, how it was going to be built, and who was going to man it. And then he would get recommendations for the lighthouse keepers, take it in, an actual president. You can see it down at the Concord Point Lighthouse where the president just says, yeah, let Mr. O'Neill be light keeper. Like be walking into the president's office right now and say, hey, sign this, and away we go. All right, Jen. Now, Pleasanton worked through district agents, and this was called the 5th District. And the agent for the 5th District was William Barney. William Barney was also famous because he was, not famous, but he should be known that he was a major of dragoons at the Battle of North Point. And you're going to find that throughout the early periods of the lighthouses all through Maryland, and I assume through the United States, a lot of these guys were all veterans of the War of 1812. So that just comes back over and over again on us. Now, Barney, and we have these quotes from the research that was done, Barney talks about negotiating with the city fathers for the plot for the lightkeeper's dwelling and the light tower. And he was not able to purchase what he wanted. And he wrote and he said, I can't buy one big large lot along the water because it is the fisheries. And the people of the fisheries lease those shorelines, and that's the sole income for the city. So that's why the tower sits on a small 400 square foot, I think it is, plot. And then it's separated from the lighthouse by a street in a short distance. And the lightkeeper's dwelling and property included originally everything from Alliance Street, those folks you who live in town would know what I'm talking about, Young Street, which has been modified a little bit now, Lafayette Street, and of course Concord Street. Okay, Jen? All right, the story, and most of you know a lot about this, the story involves two Johns. And now I knew that was going to happen. Got it. John O'Neill, I don't have to tell you, that's an entirely different lecture. It'd be too much to go into, and most of you are familiar somewhat with John O'Neill, the first lightkeeper. John Donahue I think is just as important and should be just as famous as O'Neill, because Donahue built 13 lighthouses on the Chesapeake Bay, 12 of them in Maryland, and one of them on Watts Island. And I have a book up there if you want to take a look at the Watts Island light that's sitting up there after the lecture. O'Neill was also a prominent citizen here in Havre in terms of serving on the school board and building. I think he was involved in building what is now part of the Seneca warehouse. He was a very civic person in Havre itself. Now, the number one choice of style for lightkeepers' dwellings at that time period, and right up through the first half of the 19th century, was a Cape Cod style story-and-a-half structure, and a kitchen attached on the back or on the side, depending on the topography of the land. In the upper right slide that you're looking at is Bodkin Point Light. That's underwater now. The land is washed away, it's ruins and all. Donahue actually did some repairs on it at one time before he built Concord Point. The other one at Greenberry Point, Donahue did not do. But if you look at these two and look at the facades, the fronts, the windows, the doors, and the structure, other than the towers vary from site to site. You're going to see that you have the same pattern. And based on that, the artist that we engaged at the time did this view of what the Concord Point Lightkeeper's house would look like. And when I first saw it, I thought, boy, this guy's pretty shrewd, because he did it in the evening time, so it's hard to pick up any discrepancies that people would pick on. Jen? Okay, we want to talk now, and you're going to see a lot of photos here that you may not have seen before, or maybe some of you have. Particularly, I see one or two people that are members of the Lock House Museum and History group. But some of these you may have not seen before. This is a list of the changes, and we're not going to have a quiz. I taught history, and I would tell people, okay, these are the dates you better have in your head, and usually I kept them to a relative few, and the most important. Obviously, the first is 1827, when the dwelling and the tower were constructed. 1851, they added a coal shed, or sometimes they call it the oil shed, over the well. And they had a coal shed attached to the back of that, so it's a double structure. And we'll see that later on in our archaeology. And then in 1884, this was the important renovation. That's when they changed it from a story and a half to this two-story that you see when you go down there now. That's basically how it would have looked, except for the north facade, which we kept in stone so that people could see what the 1827 structure may have looked like. And then, of course, 1920, the property was sold in May and became under private ownership. And then, of course, 1988, when the city deeded the property, was deeded the property, and the Friends took over the restoration. This is the earliest view that I have seen. Maybe there's earlier. And incidentally, if anybody does have information that can add and fill in the gaps that we do have, I'd be glad to add to it and pass it along to the Friends. But this is the earliest illustration of the light tower. But what's most interesting is the shoreline. You saw an earlier view of the shoreline from 1900, looking south with fishing racks and fishing shacks, when I told you about the problem with Barney. And if you look at this in 1863, that shoreline hadn't changed much between 1863. And this is out of Benson Lesson's pictorial history of the War of 1812. And he did this in the 1860s, and he came into Havre de Grace. He interviewed the young John O'Neill, who was then the lightkeeper. And but looking down this, you can actually see there are fishing shacks still on that. And we'll see that again in some of the later photos. Okay, Jen. Now this photo dates to about 1984, and it's taken from roughly where Market Street and the Decoy Museum would be off to the right, somewhere up in there. But again, you look at how low the shoreline is, and you can see a fishing shack in the lower right as you're facing it. If I say right or left, it's as you're facing, not from me. But we know it's 1884 because we can see the renovation. We can also see the shack over the well, the shed over the well, and the coal shed. And then I want to call your attention, you can see a very small pine tree to the left of the light tower, just a very small, looks like almost a bush. And to your left, you'll see a house, a white house, to the left of the photograph. That's called the Fletcher House, and I'll mention that a little bit later in our lecture. All right, this is an enhancement, and of course, when I do the research, I'm trying to enhance things so I can find details that help me and put them under a magnifying glass, whatever. And you can see clearly the 1884 structure. You see the coal shed, the two sheds, and you see the pine tree. And off to the left is the privy and the fence line that cut the property in half in that quarter there. And it looks like there's clothes hanging on the line. And I think there's somebody standing at the fence, but it's, even with magnifying glass, it's not quite clear. All right, this next one dates to around in fact, it was dated on the photograph, 1904, when I looked at the photograph. Notice the pine tree, how much it's grown. And what is most important is the west side of the structure. You see an addition has been put onto the 1884 structure. And that was referred to by a lady I interviewed, Grace Fletcher, at the time. They were called the Fletcher Girls. And when I interviewed them, they were right about my age. And I turned 86 in June, so the Fletcher Girls. But they were very alert, very, very sharp. And Grace was the older of the two. And she gave me a lot of information about the place. But they referred to that as the summer kitchen. And maybe that was I assume that was a term. I think I heard it more up in Pennsylvania than down here. And I'm telling my age now a little bit. Okay, the next photo. This dates to between 1904 and 1910. And I'll show you in the next photo why we say between 1904 and 1910. And it's looking down Lafayette Street from roughly a little ways down from Market Street. And if you look at the buildings, there's been a low structure added to the outbuildings, and the coal shed roof line has changed. All right? And we saw some evidence here that we understood that. And the pine tree is even taller. The rowboat that's sitting apparently in the middle of Lafayette Street would be right about where Young Street comes in. And Lafayette Street was not paved. All right? And this is sometime after 1900. All right? You were a little bit out of town when you were down there then. Sorry for my fingers. Okay, please. This was a postcard, and I'm sure a lot of people in this audience have probably seen this one. And of course, it's high water at Havre in 1910. And if you notice the outbuildings, now we have a high square structure instead of the low one that I showed you in the earlier photo. And that was referred to in the Clio Report as the high stable. And they picked that up off of a note. The other thing that you should notice is that there's a building now a house across the street from the Concord Street. Now, that's not the one that Steve Gamatori and Mr. Gamatori lived in on Pinelands. That was the Havre Grace Boat Club. And we have some nice historic photos of that. When the Gamatories were living there and I was doing work, that was around the 1990s, They called me over because I think it was their onion patch or whatever. Some of the foundations of the boat club building were still to be seen. The high water is interesting because in the receipts that we found, records for Concord Point Light Station, we found periodic receipts for lumber and nails and things like that. And the Clio folks, analysts, believe that that was because of the damage from the ice gorges and the high water, which probably occurred every spring and probably did quite some damage. All right, so that brings us up through much of the Lightkeepers period, and we're going to shift gears now. The light was automated sometime around 1916, all right? I've never really been able to pin down that date, and I couldn't find anything in the archives, and before I ran out of gas on that. And it was actually automated with acetylene gas initially. And then around 1920, they finally got electricity down there. And the Lighthouse Board, which came into existence in 1852, had already been planning for this automation, and they had decided that the lightkeepers living in the places that were being automated could remain living there until they passed away. And I think they were going to allow their widows to continue until they were gone. And then at that point, they were going to sell the property, all right, because they wouldn't need it. What they did was Henry O'Neill died in December of 1919. And he had a son, Harry Buck O'Neill, who I'll mention a little bit later on too. Millard Tidings was in Congress at that point, and he wanted to get Uncle Buck the job. And we found a little memo. It was really neat, a little office memo going from one office to a higher authority. And in the edge of the paper there, it was said, no, he can't be a lightkeeper, but we will pay him $75 a year just to take care of the grounds. And he may stay in the house until we sell it. Well, they sold it in May, and where Buck lived after that, I'm not sure, but and he was a groundskeeper. But the local legend will still make him the last lightkeeper, and that's what I was told over and over again. So that's the way he's going to be. Okay, the group that's up there right now, when the light was automated, it was maintained by the Coast Guard after 1938, and prior to that, the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And they would come up and take care of whatever needed to be done periodically. They had ships that were on the bay specifically to do that. In 1975, the Coast Guard decommissioned the light. And this group of concerned citizens, the city didn't have money to do anything with it. It was given to the city, and so they put a lock on the door. And this group of concerned citizens are part of the founders of the Friends of Concord Point Light. And it's Anna Long on the left, Al Marini from left to right, Elsie Stackhouse, she's still alive, the others aren't, Jane Jackstite, and Joe Guzman. All right, Jennifer. All right. Now, the lightkeepers dwelling in property sold in May of 1920, and I'm pretty sure it was a rental because property, Michael Fahey, I think, was as I recall, was the owner, and it apparently was a rental property because one lady brought me some photographs that was taken of it. She was born in the house, and these were photographs from her parents' collection. And then an entirely different family, a lady stopped in one day and was telling me that, pointed out in the car, her sister was sitting there, she said, my sister was born in this house. And then we moved to Aberdeen, and then I was born in Aberdeen. So it's two entirely different families in the 1920s. So the conclusion, my conclusion, is that it was rental property. At some time in the 1930s, it became a restaurant. And from that point on, it was changed ownership 9 times. And with most of the changes, there were changes to the property until the entire corner of the property was, next slide, Jen. The entire quarter of that block that I described was virtually covered with structures in 1988. The property sat empty from I think 1985 until 1988. It was called the Lighthouse Inn at that time. It underwent several changes of names. It was called the Ebb Tide, Reba's Ebb Tide, the Homestretch, and the Lighthouse Inn. Those are some of the ones that just come to the top of my head right away. But this was the problem. The entire property was covered with all of these 1988 additions, and it was left vacant. And again, current concerned citizens, I know David Craig and I know Ann Long were much involved. They got the Historic Trust to buy the property at auction. And then the trust deeded the property to the city. And the trust said, the only stipulation is we hold an easement on it perpetually, a perpetual easement. And that's important to remember. The city turned around, said to the Friends, we'd like you to restore this. Now the Friends had been running a pancake supper every year and a spring flower sale to take care of the tower. Now they had a project that turned out to finally amount to over $800,000. How are you going to do that? All right. So what they decided they could do is restore the house in 3 phases. And the way it worked was they would raise like $25,000, and the trust would match that $25,000. And we would do 1 stage, and then we would go from there. And the board got together and they decided, next slide please, that they would take the building back to the 1884 renovation. And they did this for several reasons. Number one, they didn't have any drawings or any idea of what the inside or the 1827 structure looked like, other than from looking at photographs that they'd seen of those Cape Cod styles that I showed you earlier. And they had no drawings, all right? I have a drawing now, okay, and it's up here that you can look at, but it's Cove Point, when Cove Point was built in 1828 by John. And it is the mirror image of the floor plan footprint of the building of Concord Point. So we now learned a lot from this, and I'll mention that in the archaeological part. Another reason that they decided in 1980 or 1884 was they did have drawings of that, and they did know what the inside looked like, so they could reconstruct the walls and so on. And most importantly, and most practically, being practical, is that they needed space. And 1827 wouldn't have given them the space they needed for offices and meetings and storage. And the entire second floor, as those of you who are Friends know, is not historical at all. Well, it's historical, that anything in the past is historical, but it's nothing there that's inside there that's 1884, or replicating 1884. It's all office, meeting, and storage space. Okay. All right, the first phase of the excavation, called phase 1, called for the removal of the pool room. And the pool room is in the extreme right of the upper photo. You can just barely see it. All right? And they're going to remove that. And they removed the main floor, and they removed the floor over what was the 1827-1884 kitchen area. That floor level remained the same through all of the renovations of the 1920s. So they removed these, and then stabilization of the building. These were the most important things that they had to do, all right? And at that point, we had a man in the audience today. I'm sorry, it's going to take more time with my fingers. Yeah, thank you. Another daughter. I got them all over the place. A Turkish fellow told me one time he had 2 children and 3 daughters. And I said, yeah, but you take care of your daughters. He said, yeah, because they take care of you in your old age. And you just saw that. Okay. At the time, it was called the Harford County Archaeological Society. And it since changed, and changed because we cover an entire region, not the entire northern Chesapeake, not just Harford County. And they agreed to do the excavations, but we needed a professional archaeologist as a principal investigator, and we were fortunate enough to get 79-year-old Dr. Kenneth Gordon Orr, professor at Chicago, archaeologists all over the world. It was like getting Jim Palmer or the ace pitcher for the New York Yankees to come down and pitch for your Little League team. Well, he did a lot of schmoozing and a lot of advice to me. He mentored me through this. And we developed a research design and an excavation plan. By the way, Dr. Orr was on site for the first 2 excavation sessions, spring and fall of '93, and then his health turned bad, so I just went to see him and consulted him and got advice. And then before our last phase 3, he passed away. So I was on my own to finish it up through the other years. But we had to submit a research design and an excavation plan, which is required by the trust. And this is the drawing that I did for that. And thank you. And on the drawing, you'll see various numbers, and these are where we were going to put in test units or shovel test pits, what we call them STPs. And they're only about this square and deep, unless we dig a unit, and then it's larger. And the first excavation called for digging 1, 16, 10, and 14. One is in the northeast corner, which is, as you face it, the lower right corner of the main structure, right next to the foundation. 10 is in the 1884, 1827 kitchen area. 16 was out where the pool room was, and 14 was in the back, and Dr. Fred Ciuto worked on that, as I recall, that first time. We were looking there for any evidence of a wooden walkway that went out to the back and then led to the privy. And this was described to me by Grace Fletcher. All right, next, please. And Mr. Phil Powell was there. Always had a lot of help from young people in his town. And Phil, with the construction experience and surveying experience, helped me to lay out a site grid from which the drawing you saw before. And these 2 photos show we were standing over where the lavatories are now, the restrooms are now. And we wanted something permanent for a reference point, what we call a data point. And so I decided we'd use the concrete base of the big pole that held the chain link fence around the treatment plant or whatever was there. And guess what? That's long gone. I thought it was going to be there forever. But because I had the grid already, we could readjust. We could readjust that reference point. Okay, so on June 19th of 19, you're going to have to. Why don't you just sit up here and just jump up and do this? Why don't you sit here? She taught school all day today. Now she's got to put up with me. Okay. And I know it was, I always remember it because June 19th was my birthday, and it was also by the time we finished in the afternoon, 102 degrees. These are a few photos at first excavation. And the lady in the upper right is digging that unit right down by the foundation. We wanted to see the builder's trench to get an idea of what kind of materials we were going to run through. And lo and behold, in the lower left, Mr. Wilbur Eiley, who was 79 at the time, and our Indian artifact expert, he pulled out what you would call an arrowhead, but it was probably a knife blade spear point, a quartz Piscataway point. And I looked at that, and I admit my stupidity at the time said, oh, ho-hum, somebody dropped it, and it just got in that mix or whatever. Didn't think about it too much. Next photo, please. This is the group, and Phil's got the guy kneeling in the front there with his son now has gray hair. Sorry, I think that called attention to that, Phil. But at the left, you see digging inside that 1884, 1827 is Kirsty Unilo. And I was fortunate because I asked her to take charge of that unit. And I didn't realize it at the time. She was finishing up her master's degree at UMBC in archaeology. She now, I think, is still working down with the state at Jeff Patterson facility down in Prince George's County. But I was lucky because she came to me and she said, I think we have a horizon piece. And I'll tell you about this in a minute. But it was a piece of pottery and then also a marble. And it told us two different dating periods inside that 1827, 1884 kitchen area. And this photo, the next one, shows it shows a test unit that we went very deep. We dug a trench across the east wall a certain distance, but then we took this one section down to the point where I could slide a trowel under the footer of the foundation. That way we knew we had the original soil, whatever. And this area became probably the most important key for interpreting the rest of the site. We also had dug a small unit in the southwest corner, and in the lower photo, you see one of the things that came out of that. Another arrowhead, spear point, blade, whatever you want to call it. And again, I didn't think too much about it. And I do remember riding down the road one day, taking Dr. Orr back to Baltimore and telling him, oh, gee, I wasn't thinking about this. And then he said, kind of looked at me and said, I was wondering how long it was going to take you to catch on to that. So it was a learning experience. Next slide, please. All right, this is from my original preliminary report. And actually, you're going to see the evolution of my work because I'm doing all of this with a Smith Corona word processor and correctable or whatever, and then hand drawing all of the drawings for the report. But these are what we call soil profiles, and the one to your left is the one from inside the kitchen. And it was the most important because we found two what we call occupational layers and two sterile layers. The occupational layers went from 1988 back to 1884. The 1988 was a McDonald's wrapper or something. It was laying on the surface from the guys that were working there. And then these horizon pieces that she had shown me indicated that we were going back from 1884 to 1827. And then below that, we found sterile soil, which had no evidence of ever being occupied. And we had two different types of soil. And that's important that we know what kind of soil we're going into. And a little later in the lecture, you'll see that we use this information. But that gave us some good information. And that particular room is the most important, archaeologically speaking, in terms of restoring things. All right, please. We went back in the fall to do some more excavation, but everything had to be done on the exterior of the property. And you see the excavation going on at the right. By the way, the tripods that we had used there that you see in there, Mr. Phil Powell constructed those for me, if I remember. But we did that for a kids project over at Harford Glen when we started out with that. But all this testing had to be done outside. The interesting thing is that the test unit 3 on the left, we also found another blade, a different kind of blade, prehistoric blade. All of a sudden it started dawning on me, maybe people were occupying or on this site long before it became a lightkeeper's site, and we're here for a while. However, the 1993 testing gave us a lot of important results. First of all, the most important was understanding the soil, because most of the lot was disturbed with a lot of backfill. We have a record of John O'Neill, within 6 weeks of moving into the property, ordering a cartload of fill to fill depressions, low spots on the property. And people were doing it right on up till 1988, I'm sure, through all periods of history. And we'll mention that a little bit later. The other thing that we did was we were able to identify some of the original structural elements that the Clio people couldn't find. And that's why they wanted us to do this. And then finally, it began to dawn on me that we may have a prehistoric occupation. But I was so focused on the late period, I honestly admit I missed a few things. All right, next, please. The Phase 2 project, money was raised again, and finally a match and a plan. The Phase 2 called for removing all of the post-1920 materials, the post-Lighthouse period materials from the property. And these photographs, and that would actually allow us to get inside. If you look at the dark, heavy lined, large area, everything's going to be taken away. And I've sketched in where the well and the two 1851 structures should have been, some evidence for them. And you can see units that are inside that structure, and that's what we wanted to get to. Please. These are just some of you who were around town at that time probably remember seeing this heavy equipment yanking the structure apart and hauling it away. And we put one of these orange snow fence types things to keep people out, just because of the liability of somebody getting in there and getting hurt with equipment. All right, once all that was removed, we would be able to look and see what was under it. And out on that Lafayette Street side, where the oil shed and coal shed were, we were going to be looking for the remains of the walls. However, in the 1920s, a concrete foundation was put in for a long building, and that would have destroyed the east wall, the south wall, and the north wall. But we took measurements, and we put in a 1 foot wide, 2 foot long trench. And I remember Wilbur Eiley was in charge of that, and young Ann Pearson was working with him on that. And lo and behold, at the right distance, we found the west wall of the oil shed and covering the well. We knew where the well was. Once we tore up the floor, we could see the opening of the well. And then we also saw the west wall of the coal shed. All right. I recall being in another unit. Please. Thank you. I'm sorry. Now you can see the change in technology. I did this with the computer and computer drawing. Sometimes I like the hand drawings better, though. And in my report, I include a lot of stuff, because I was a school teacher, and I like to show the work with warts and all, because you knew they did it. And now you knew I did it, because you'll see some warts in that. But this is a view of that long, heavy concrete foundation and the two west walls, the trenches, and of course the well area. The well is now capped with a metal cap. But while I was over in these units, we're talking with somebody, old Wilbur Eiley, I called over and, how you doing there, Wilbur? And he says, oh, I'll be fine as soon as I get rid of these flat rocks. Now, please don't stop. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking for. So wonderful working with these people, and they taught me a lot. And here with just a very little bit of removing some dirt and debris, we were able to find in the upper two photos the threshold stone, which is that was outside that south door. Just as you go down the steps into the kitchen, you see the doorway there, and that door was raised. Remember now, that doorway was raised in 1884, and you can actually see the lintel, the 1827 lintel, and you can also see the brick in the wall above the stone of the 1827. So a lot of neat structural features still there. In the lower right, we in the rear of the building, we found post molds indicating that there was a porch or something, because there was a back door from the post-1920 buildings, most likely the restaurant that was put there in the 1930s. And underneath, between those post molds, there was the remains of a brick pad, just like you see when you go up into Frederick or some of these southern Pennsylvania towns. You see the porches, and underneath them are a brick pad. And then there was a walkway, a brick walkway, that went from the kitchen area over to that long outbuilding, which we now call the dance hall, after it's a restaurant. And I picture them fixing food, taking it out there. I could be wrong, but that makes the most sense, especially when we see some of the later drawings. Okay. And this is the drawing that I came up with once we had finished our excavations. You see the area that's in red? That would have been an entire brick area back in the 1930s. All right? And the long building out there was a dance hall, and I know it was a dance hall because while I was working there, a lady came up and said, oh boy, when I was young, I loved dancing there. And then Johnny Gallagher came up and said, Bill, move to the left a little bit, run your trail, and you'll find a T-bone steak and an oyster shell. I said, an oyster shell. I said, how come? He said, that's where I had my last meal before I shipped out in the Navy in 1943. So there you are. Okay. Next, please. This is what the place looked like after we finished the Phase 2 demolition, looking from the Lafayette Street side. And that the ground there is what we call the most archaeologically sensitive ground. That's where most of whatever you're going to find that's important is going to be. You go out past the fence, north and south, out in the field, you're out in a pasture. You're out in a place where not much has happened unless somebody drops a horseshoe or something like that. And this ground was about a foot or so lower than the ground around it, which constitutes, like a bathtub, a drain. So anytime we had a huge rainfall, the water was running there, and where does it go? Down the back cellar steps into the lighthouse. And we did have to clean it out on 2 occasions. In fact, the city came down and had some guys clean it out from filling up. So what we did, we covered the ground with a porous cloth, and then we brought in backfill, and some of it came from a project that was going on just up the street. I think it was where Tidewater was putting in that building that's on Market Street, and because there was a coal yard up in that area. And in later times, we found some of the remains of the coal from the coal yard, not coal from the lighthouse. We found that in other digs. All right, let's see if I can get this on my own. I can't. I did. Okay. All right, well, we were well into the project at this point, but between phases, and Bob McGee, who was a real good friend to us, because if he saw something that he thought belonged down there, he'd call me, and we would, at Lockhouse, and we would get it in the right place. In particular, a marker stone that belonged at the lightkeeper's house and is in your front room there. At any rate, he came up with a photograph that I hadn't seen before, and these photographs were donated by Kenny Lay, and two of the earlier ones, I think, was by Kenny Lay. But this was important because it's the only one we had from the east side, the front of the house. And one of the things that we were going to be interested in was restoring the porch in the front of the house. And if you look at the photo, and I should have enhanced this one for you, but there was a larger photo, all the way included the light tower. When I put the magnifying glass on it, there's a tree there in front of the house, and there's a man standing right next to the tree, and there's not an automobile, horseless carriage, the stick type. And about that time, we were looking at the history of the Burns wagon factory here, and they apparently produced a horseless carriage from the lecture that I heard over in Aberdeen one time. So I was wondering if that was a Burns horseless carriage. But I was really focused on what was under the tree, because there was the single bay porch, and it looked very much like you saw in the photographs earlier in the early Cape Cod houses and the artist rendition, and what was described by the architect's report that we should find. Well, next please. There were 3 porches there. You had that single bay porch, and then it was replaced sometime after 1900. We know this by the work that we ended up doing, by what they call the long porch. And if you look at the Sanborn map, you can see kind of dotted in the long porch, and I think that extends right into city street property, which, or the city right-of-way, which I think a lot of old house porches around Havre do. And that's the long porch that, when I came to town, people could tell me their memories of it as youngsters and being on the site. And one of the ladies who was born in the house brought this photograph to me. That was taken, she said, around 1925, and that's the long porch. All right, and it's fun because you have the canoe with the planter in the front, and you see that pillar, Carol. You see that pillar on the right-hand side that has USLS, U.S. Light Service on it. All right, and it can't be 1827 because the U.S. Light Service didn't come into existence until after 1848. So it's sometime at that time period, but that's the one that Bob McGee told me. I think that belongs down there, and I said, I think you're right. Now, more importantly, if you look to the left, you'll see the roof line of that long building that was constructed over that long foundation. So these were important to us. It's a different kind of digging in a library, and being lucky enough for somebody to show up and say, hey, you want to look at this picture? And I'd say, yeah. Well, this picture dates to the 1950s, and it was given to me by Dave Hansen, whose hands are shown there. I cut him out of the picture because it was a larger picture with him standing with shoulder. And now I got some old timers here. He told me he was helping to put in was there a soda shop or a hamburger stand or something down there at one time in the 50s, because he said he was doing this for somebody. But I was interested in what was in the background, because we still have the long porch, but on the left-hand side, we have a structure that connected this building. They punched a hole through that wall in the 1884 wall and had a passageway into that outbuilding, the dance hall building. And that was done sometime in the 1940s, all right, by Brad Kilman, I believe was the owner at the time. And some of you old-timers may remember him. All right, well, we were ready for the third phase of the demolition. And in the upper 2 photos, we had a company called the Grubb Brothers, and they were very, very cooperative in helping us, because the long porch had been replaced around 1965 by a 9x9 concrete slab porch over concrete block and rubble fill. And they agreed to take this porch apart archaeologically. That meant piece by piece. And they went to work in the morning, and I went down there and watched. And come noontime, I said, okay, I'm ready. And I went and called Ann Pearson. She was home from college at the time. And I said, come on over. It's time for us to go to work. And these guys said, we can give you 2 days. We can work on something else. The other part of this third phase thing was some more stabilization of the chimneys that were getting damaged, and repointing all of the walls and repointing all of the brickwork, removing the modern brick facade that was on there during the Lighthouse Inn period, and then removing that 9x9 porch. And Ann and I got in there, and the first thing we did, the front end loader came in and got the last scoop that I allowed him to do with that, and we looked through it, picked out the chunks of rock, and then we found a few artifacts showing we had a zone here where we're getting down to the porch that was there before that one. And Dr. Orr had told me when we were talking about finding that porch, he said, you're going to find a couple of flat stones and a lot of dotted lines. Well, this is what we found. And that's Ann in the upper left. And then I was finished shovel shaving. And then we did trowel. And then in the lower photograph, those are our folding tapes to get measurements and to plot everything. You'll see some flat stones, and then the soil below the stones is actually the sterile soil that matched the sterile soil from the excavation at Unit 10 and fit our profile very nicely. And sure as heck, Dr. Orr was right. We found flat stones and dotted lines. And I love showing this because this is Ann's work that she did right there in the field, and it was just so, the work was so good that Ann and some of the other folks did when they did drawings for us. Now, we took those flat stones, we measured the elevations, we have them diagrammed where they are, etc., and we chalk marked them, and we stored them. Unfortunately, we stored them in the cellarway of the back of the house, and they are now sitting under a concrete slab that was put in there in 2004 for the handicap lift. I don't know that anyone would really want to restore the porch that way anyhow. The Grubb brothers also did us another favor. There was this 10 by 10 square rubble platform that came up just above the 1824 floor level, or just about at that level. And it was then covered by an iron plate that was 2 inches thick. And we wanted to get that out of there so we could finish excavating and seeing the earlier floor level. And the only way they could do it was go in there and break it up with heavy mauls, as you see there. Now, I was young enough at that time, I could have probably swung it 2 or 3 times. Then I would have handed it back to the Grubb brothers. And then you see the rubble down below. We cleared that all away, and we're able to excavate the kitchen area. That's it. Yeah. All right. And this is views when we did the final excavation of the area, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And my right-hand man through the project, through this entire project, was Jack Davis in the upper left-hand corner. And unfortunately, Jack passed away a couple weeks ago. We'll miss him. But he was a year older than me, so he wasn't going to do any more excavating like that either. Okay. Now, about 60% of the artifacts that are on display and that we got from the site came out of that kitchen area because after 1884, and the restaurant disturbed it very little. The main building, the main structure, had a concrete floor put over the basement, so we weren't really able to do anything with that. And this is a picture of some of the ceramics and clay pipes, and glass, crockeryware, and that the ceramic report, which is a very important catalog for us, was done by Ann Pearson, and she was working at the Maritime Museum at the time, and Jerry Warner was an intern for me, and she was training Jerry for that. Next slide, please. And these are a close-up of some of those, and you can see some of that on the board up here after I finish talking, and I will finish shortly. Be patient. My favorite artifact is this one. We found all but one or two of these fragments in that kitchen area. It's a hand-painted bowl, and I remember Grace Fletcher and Timmy Burke's grandmother, that both ladies remember that time period, and they said Mrs. O'Neill liked to do hand-painted pottery. I absolutely have no idea whether Mrs. O'Neill did this piece of pottery or whether she bought it somewhere or showed up anywhere. But it's absolutely beautiful piece, and it's on display down there. And most of those fragments came from that kitchen. Now, for us and for the restoration, the next drawing, please. This is the most important thing that we came up with. And I've tried to keep the technical diagrams to a minimum here. We're looking at the top is the west side of the kitchen, the back of the kitchen that faces up toward Market Street. The lower part faces toward the river. And if you look at the diagram, what we found was a retaining wall across the center of from left to right, about a little more than center, from the and we know it was retaining wall because it only went about that deep. All right, it didn't go all the way down, matching the footer. And then we found this very stone formation in the west side where the hearth would have been. But over on this side, we found these niches. And we had seen these early in the very first excavations. We saw one or two of these, and we were trying to figure out why they were there. And they were evenly spaced, and they had a flat stone underneath them. And so we figured out, oh. And then in its center, we found a couple flat stones that ran from the retaining wall toward the east wall. But some of them had been knocked aside by 20th century structure, pushing pipes through the ground to add plumbing or whatever with the restaurants and dance halls and all that, and the bar that was all going on there. But at any rate, what we figured was that when Donahue constructed this, he was laying the floor joists north to south from those niches. They were being supported in the center by the flat stones. The retaining wall became the hearth area, and this allowed us to do a reconstruction. I do need, that one's really stuck together. I thought I had them loosened up. And Floyd Dobson and Jack Davis and I were able to reconstruct the 1827 floor, which you can see when you go in there to visit the lighthouse, and that's pretty accurate. Jack told me about the rock dust that I could get for free up at the quarry. We went up, got a load of that, and then we put in the brick apron. We didn't try to restore the hearth area because it was the hearth itself, because it was destroyed so much by the 20th century structures that we didn't want to fake anything, all right? So when you go in there, you can now see the 1827 floor, and then you can see the timbers that supported the 1884 floor, and I think that's important. All right. We went back in, I think it was 2004, and I think we went back 2004, yeah, or maybe, yeah, 2004, because the Friends wanted to put in, they wanted to open the place to the public, but they had to put in a handicap lift. And they came up with this pad and the lift that's out there in the back that you can see if you go look at it. But we knew that there was archaeological sensitive stuff there. So we went down and we opened up 4 units in that areas where I showed you the brick pathway, brick walkway. And I want to call your attention to the one in the center, all right? Because when we got down in there, and there was a young lady from Washington College, from Bel Air, that just graduated from Washington College. She happened to be working in there, and she almost took out all of this stuff before I caught her, about 2 to 3 inches below the brick walk. We discovered what you saw in the lower unit. Those 3 rocks are what remain of a microsite, what we call a microsite, a campsite. And the artifactual materials, next slide please, that we found associated with it told us that this site dated to possibly the late Archaic period. That's roughly 3,500 years ago. 3,500 years ago, somebody was sitting there either chipping their knife blade, maybe eating some shad roe, I don't know. But it kind of gave me a thrill. And it gives me a thrill because the other thing, as far as I know, this is the only prehistoric material excavated in Havre de Grace, in situ, in place. Now, I've seen a grooved axe. Cecil Hill has a grooved axe that was found out in his backyard by his father. Norman Montgomery gave me 2 spear points that were found when they were doing some construction over there where she lived. But these are not in an archaeological context. But I will say the spear points also dated to roughly 3,000 years ago. So finally, as Dr. Orr said, oh, you finally got caught on. You finally did. Well, actually, we got a good hint because when Wilbur Eiley was digging with Ann, he found some flake materials, and then it began to dawn on me, we really do have possible prehistoric occupation here. I thought we were all finished working down there, but the friends decided that they wanted to locate the privy. So I got several hardy souls, Dan, one of them, and Ann Pearson designed a research design and plan to do it, but the trust would not accept the plan because the plan called for taking off a large area of the topsoil back in the area where we were looking, and that's the right way to do it. And we put most of that topsoil there, so it wasn't like we were disturbing anything important. But at any rate, they wouldn't allow us to do it. So we came up with a plan to do it with shovel test pits. And I would never, if I knew ahead of time, I would have never tried to do it because we had to go through broken stone, we had to go through some places where they put tarmac to fill holes for parking lot, gravel. That was the worst digging I think that we ever did, and Dan will attest to that. And we weren't really able to come up and define what we were looking for. A couple of things gave us hints, but if we went back to look for it, we'd have to take off the topsoil, and consequently, we'd also have to move some of your herb gardens. So I don't think that's going to happen, and maybe it's not important. Please. Okay, I met a lot of people and made a lot of new friends. At least I think they're still our friends in this project, and that's one of the benefits of the archaeological work that we did in this society is the people you meet, especially with the different skills and talents that they bring to bear, and particularly proud of the 3 teenagers. I think they were all around 15. Renee was 15 when she was there that first dig. Yes. Renee Ciuto on the left, Ann Pearson at the top, and Jerry Warner. And they're all grown, they're all professionals in the field in some related way, have their master's degrees. And they're all, I'll tell you, between the 3 of them, there's more brain power than is in this entire room. They were smart, and Ann particularly would call me on a mistake I would make. When we were digging for the porch, if I may digress just a little, I know we're getting on toward the end here. When we were digging for the porch, we came down, we found 2 pieces of pottery, and they're on display in the thing. And I looked at them, I said, I'm trying to figure out what this is. And she said, oh, that's a man's vest and a bow tie. And down below, I could see James Blaine. So after we finished, James Blaine ran for Republican for president in the 1880s. And The O'Neills were Republicans, Lincoln Republicans. He served in the Union Army. In fact, two O'Neills served in the Union Army. One of them lays, I think, in a grave and was killed in Petersburg, I think. But at any rate, I went up to the library, got out the encyclopedia, looked up Blaine, because I didn't know much about him. And sure enough, there was the picture that had been copied onto that plate, James G. Blaine. But I said, Ann, how did you know it was a bow tie and a desk? She says, well, because I like digging historic stuff, but you keep putting me on out there with all those broken stones and rocks. Okay. Next slide is another thing that I'm particularly fond of. It's two paintings that were done by Chris White. Chris said to me one time, he said, you know, Bill, when I was growing up, all of the boys' hero was Mickey Mantle. All right, for some of you young folks, I'll have to explain who Mickey Mantle was, I guess. But he said, my hero was Norman Rockwell. And you see it in Chris's work. And Chris was meticulous in reproducing it as historically accurate as possible. He's done work for many famous things, including, I think, a stamp. And he took all of the reports and all the material I had, and he studied it, and he looked at the archaeological results that we had and whatever, and then he did the painting. But then he had, like Rockwell, had to put people in it. And the upper one was done for the Decoy Museum for a decoy festival. And in order to get a grant to do this, they had to have wildlife in it. So, but they wanted Concord Point. They wanted the lighthouse. So the way they got away with it was put those geese flying in the background in the sky, and that's the wildlife. But the Rockwell part is great because he's picturing young Millard Tidings waving to his grandfather, Henry O'Neill, coming up after the light. And then the lower one was done specifically for the Friends. John Narvell and I really were very, wanted this very badly for when we were going to open it for the public. And Chris came up with a spring scene because he says, you're reawakening, it's the rebirth, and it's the rebirth of the Lightkeeper's house. And he painted a scene that has possibly Henry O'Neill mending the fences after the spring high water and ice. And the African American that's with him, side story here, when John O'Neill, the original lightkeeper, died in 1938, he had in his will that his indentured servant, a young 10-year-old boy, would be freed, manumitted, at age 35, as near as he could reckon. And he would work in his son William's nail factory. And L. Nathan Woodhouse, my wife called my attention to Woodhouse's work, spoke of the memoirs of the late 1800s, his life in the 1800s here in Havre, and he talks about Big Jim, the black foreman at the nail factory. And I look at this picture and I'd say, I wonder if that's Big Jim helping out Henry O'Neill. Of course, that's just, I guess fiction, but it's nice to know. And if you're going to do archaeology, you've eventually got to come back to it. It's all about explaining people. And I told you about the Fletcher house. If you look in the upper right, he even picked that up. He put the Fletcher house in there, and he said, I wonder if Grace Fletcher would recognize the house. I said, I don't know. I think it's still standing there, but it's kind of unrecognizable. All right. Next slide, please. All right. In 1920, as I said, Buck O'Neill was the caretaker. I'm sorry that this slide is so bad, but it was taken from a newspaper. And it's Buck O'Neill standing, looking out over the water. And he has a uniform on and a cap on. He also, if you look close enough, has a hole in his knee. And he was paid as a caretaker. But this was taken from a newspaper for his obituary. And he had rescued a guy who had fallen overboard down near Still Pond, I think it was. And then also, he was most known for being able to extract the roe from the shad down at the fishing battery. And I'd like to show that because just recently, there's more and more things that come up. And, you know, archaeology is science. It's a science, it's an art, and it's a science. And science, as you know, improves when you learn more. You go on the evidence that you have, but there's other evidence perhaps out there. And as recently as, I think it was 4 weeks ago, Dan brought an article about descendants, were interviewed, descendants of the Fletchers, and it was in a decoy carving magazine. So you can find these things in the strangest places. Okay. That pretty much brings it to a close. I want to thank you for your patience. I know it's been long, and I have some limitations here, and it makes it a little tough. But I do want to thank Steve Gamatoria, Risa Laird, Jeff Thompson, and Jimmy Burrell, the staff here at City Hall, for taping this and recording this for the Friends. And I want to thank most of all for all of you taking the time and patience to sit and listen to me. And I hope that this is a connection for all of those people that are coming along who have no idea about what went on in this town back in that particular time. And I do hope that more research will be done, but done with the 1930s and 40s and connected with the new racehorse magazine. Just think of what was going on in town with the racetrack. And I know some people are saying some things that aren't so nice that were going on, but it's part of our history. And then in World War II, 1940s, Docky Green told me that the big band musicians that had joined the Navy and were in the Army, they'd get together Friday night down there in that dance hall and have jam sessions, and that it was written up in Downbeat magazine. So I know there's a lot of stories, and Charlie Ware told me some good stories about the 50s and 60s down there. And then one lady who sang there when she was in high school. She shouldn't have been singing there, her mother told me. But she was up from Atlanta, Georgia, and I was coming out of the light tower. I'd been working, cleaning the windows, I think. And she asked me if I was associated with it. I said, yeah, I help out down here. And she said, looked over there and she said, boy, my brother and his band, we made that joint rock. And she was the most elegant lady in shoes and all. So there's so many good stories that come around the place. And I hope the torch will be passed to people who are interested and want to do some more research and add to the town's history. Thank you. I will stick around and answer. The things I have up here are some things that you wouldn't normally see. I've got Latrobe's drawings up there. It's absolutely a treasure. I've got that floor plan from Cove Point that you can see. The rooms are named, by the way. And there's a stairway